All right. I've been, I think I can say excited for this book club conversation for some time now, since I discovered that there was a young author, a new author, in a class that I was teaching last fall. And as I was getting to know her and meeting with her, I thought she's a fabulous young woman, a fabulous individual. And the topic that she has written about is so necessary for us to have a conversation. So I'm very excited for today's Career Conversations Book Club with the one and only Taya Mikado. And I am so excited that you're joining us. So Taya, welcome for this evening.
Thank you so much for having me, Gina. This has been really a huge honor to be here and to be having these conversations with you and have been planning this with you since we got to meet during class. It's really fun, full circle moment.
It is a full circle moment. So I just want to go through for anybody watching now or anybody watching later on, a few of the requirements or the reminders as we move forward. First of all, if you want to post anything about the conversation, feel free to do so with hashtag GA Career Conversations, and tag both of us. I don't think we'd mind that. As we'll hear soon from a little bit more from our guest tonight, who I'm thrilled to have, I want to start off with a few things. First of all, the format for tonight. If you're new to the book club, we talk a little bit about our author's career first for a little bit, and then we'll turn into questions that I will ask about the book that we've discussed in the past, the author and I, and then we will move into questions that you might have or comments that you might have for that last 30 minutes. Now, I know that when Tay and I were going through the prep, we've got a lot to cover in any event, so we can go on, but we do want to give voice to others as well. And so if you have questions or comments, please feel free at that last part to join us. And the microphone, if you can, please keep your microphones muted until the last 30 minutes. If you have comments or questions, feel free to put them in the chat. She and I will be looking at that and see if there's comments or questions that we can respond to. The recording, as I mentioned, we are having it so that people can see it afterwards. And that's also partly because the LSO has allowed for this particular conversation, the full 90 minutes is EDI credit. Given the nature of the conversations that we're going to be having this evening, it is 1 hour and 30 minutes of EDI credit. I don't usually do this, but given the topic of the book and some of the topics that we'll see in this grief thing fucking sucks, I thought it was really appropriate to have trigger warnings. And that in large part, if you've got the book, if you've seen the book, you'll see that Taya thinks about that right up front and puts trigger warnings right up front. So we will be discussing a variety of issues around grief, around mental health, suicide, and racism. And we want to offer you that opportunity to just have that warning ahead of time. I also want to say the following, that this can be a conversation that is difficult. I think, Taya, one of the things that you've done is to try and make this a beautiful conversation and to try and find some positives in the conversation. And I so am grateful to you for doing so. Nevertheless, I recognize that some of the topics might be really difficult for others. And so we want you to practice self-care as you need, whether it's to turn off your video, turn off your mute your microphone, or even just take a step away if something does become a little bit more difficult than what you expected. We welcome you and encourage you to practice self-care. And while we'll talk about safe spaces later on, for this particular book club and for all my book clubs, what I oftentimes remind people, and I've sent this through in earlier emails to those who've registered. So if you are watching this later, you'll hopefully be able to see the safe space requirement or the the accountable space requirement, my apologies. And I remember reading the work of Elise Ahencora some time ago, where she talked about how exhausting brave spaces can be. And what she writes about, and the link is in the email that I've sent to others, is that let's look at an accountable space where we are each being responsible for ourselves, our intentions, our words, and our actions. It means coming into a space as we are today all together with good intentions, but understanding that aligning your intent with action is the real test of commitment. And so for that, I will ask that we adhere with the accountable space guidelines that I sent previously. So I'm going to stop sharing because I want to be able to see everybody and move forward. And I'll be monitoring so that if others come in, I'll be able to let them in. Taya, let's start with you first and foremost. again, the topic of the book club is career conversation. So we also always start with the author. And I'd love for you to tell us and for others who are watching later, because they oftentimes crave that information about, well, how did you get to do the things that you're doing up until this point? Recognizing a career is a lifelong journey, but up until now, can you share with us some of your personal highlights? How did you start? Why did you start each of those? And when did you move on? And I will say at this point, I think we can congratulate you because one of the things that you are doing is convocating from law school soon. So big congrats to you. I'm really, really happy and proud for you and of you. So tell us a little bit about how you got to this particular place and time.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think it'll be a shorter conversation. My career experience thus far has been limited, and it's definitely embarking on a new chapter of career and what that means come after June. Uh, at this time, most of my career experience has been classic work that students do to be able to support themselves throughout school, work that we did during high school. I've worked doing a lot of odd jobs throughout my life, whether it be hostessing, working in restaurants. My family actually has a farm, so I was kind of working as a farmhand for summers, doing lots of landscaping type of work. But ultimately, my foray into writing started because I did an undergraduate degree in philosophy, and I really became in love with language, taking philosophy of language courses, taking creative writing, a few courses as well. And then throughout my grief process, finding that writing was quite a therapeutic tool for me. I never aspired, and I write a little bit about that in the book. I never really aspired to be a writer or an author. It's not, I didn't take a creative writing undergrad. I was really interested in philosophy and theory. And I also had an inkling that I wanted to go down the law path. But writing was more so something that I did therapeutically, and it evolved into a book that I felt comfortable enough to publish. And that is also why I chose to self-publish, because it wasn't something that I was willing to put more time and effort into to go down a traditional route to adhere to a bunch of editors kind of interests. And I had run it by a couple of editors, professional editors, who said that this style they might ask me to change the style or go all poetry or all memoir. And I was like, this is more just a personal piece, and something that is going to kind of help me close this one chapter in my journey and kind of allow me to take the next step that I need in healing, but also in the next types of careers that I want to take. Interestingly, on the career topic, I have gotten a lot of really wonderful opportunities because of this book. After publishing, I did some outreach to make it available in my local communities, and it actually secured me a job with the Bereaved Families of Ontario, which is a nonprofit organization that does peer support. I'd reached out to them saying would be willing to drop off some copies if anybody, in your groups would ever be interested in a book of this nature. And they got back to me asking to do the volunteer training if I'd be interested. And I said, that'd be awesome. Why not? I've never done peer support, but it sounds great. And then they needed a communications lead shortly after that. And they asked me to do it. So I've been doing that for almost a year now. And through those types of connections and whatnot, I've gotten to do a lot of work in the grief community, which I find is a beautiful new part of my relationship to grief and healing. And I am really, really grateful that the book has led me here.
Well, it's interesting how you use the term your relationship to grief and healing. And I think that's a really wonderful perspective to have, that we do have a relationship with this emotion and everything that's around grief. And so I really respect how you approach this topic. And congratulations on the job and on your graduation that's coming up soon. But one of the questions, and I know you and I had this separate conversation, offline, but one of my favorite words, and we'll talk more about it in a different context, is serendipity. But in terms of your career, have you planned the whole thing out from when you were applying to law school or to undergrad and then to university? Or did you just kind of have things happen sometimes serendipitously that led you to one door, as you described from the work that you've been doing for the past year? Which of the two or both have been applicable in your own career so far?
I would definitely say it's been both. I, from a young age, kind of had my mindset on being a lawyer. And so there was always that kind of motivator to go to university. These were kind of the steps that I would have to take. And I'm glad I had that goal despite everything that happened in my life, because I think that it helped me work through and it gave me something to work towards. But a lot of my odd jobs along the way and a lot of the passions and the ways that actually I now engage with like legal work and what I want to do as a lawyer definitely arose serendipitously out of my grief and out of this book. And the publishing it during my second year of law school also really shifted what I had originally come into law school thinking I was going to do. And now having a pretty strong interest in wills and estates to be closely aligned with grief. That is definitely a more serendipitous thing that has come about of my career so far.
It's interesting. You said publishing it in the second year sort of changed a bit of the trajectory. What did you, when you thought about, when you came into to law school, what were you thinking you would do at the end of the 3 years? Did you have something specific in mind, or was it open at that point?
I would say I was fairly open-minded, but I did have a strong interest in technology. I had done an undergraduate that focused in the latter part of my philosophy degree. I did an honors that focused on artificial intelligence ethics. So I was thinking I'd go somewhere in that direction. And I did actually complete a placement at an intellectual property boutique. But after publishing the book and after working at Bereaved Families of Ontario and doing a lot of work in these grief spaces, I realized it wasn't something that I wanted to shy away from. And I also heard a lot of stories about relationships to lawyers in the wills and estate spaces in these grief conversations. And I was curious about whether that would be something that I would be well suited for. And then I ended up taking wills and estates as a course, and it was one of my favorites. So
Again, another serendipitous moment. Earlier today, I think I may have shared with you, I came from the law practice program's 10th anniversary, and there was a presentation before that about AI in the legal profession. And even in wills and estates and solicitors' work and litigators' work, AI and technology are going to be impacting how we carry out our responsibilities. So that whole idea about technology and technology law, whether it's in wills and estates or in anything else that you choose to do, you'll probably still be able to have your fingers on the tech side of things. So may not seem that far from what you entered into law school to do. Let me ask you, only because you talked about your family had a farm. Is there something from that experience that you have used or taken with you to law school, or that you think you might be using in the profession? I'm just curious if there's any links there in terms of some of the experience that you had there.
I think that anybody that's probably done a lot of manual labor can say that you learn really good work ethic working those jobs. So definitely spending summers like chopping trees, like and mowing lawns and doing kind of dirty work gave me, I think, a pretty good work ethic. But no, nothing I would say in relationship to the law specifically. But I definitely understand I think it taught me at a young age, hard days work and also the value of like time off and finding
Yeah.
time to recuperate after that, especially physically.
So perfect segue, completely unintentional, to the first comment that, well, no, it'll be the second one, but all about resilience. And we'll get to that in a second, because taking time off is really, really important. But let's park that for a second. Let's start with your why. You've talked about this being something that you needed to do to help yourself heal, but tell us about why you wrote this book, why you decided to put it out there into the world, self-publish it, go through the process of really putting yourself out there and then putting this beautiful piece out into the world.
Uh, I feel like I've evolved my why many times now as I start to also reflect back on like, okay, what was I actually thinking and what was my mental state during the writing of this book and deciding these things. To start, I always was just found writing therapeutic, and it was a collection of poems and stories and pieces that kind of all sat on my computer for the longest time and in a journal. And so eventually I kind of started piecing it together, and I talked to some friends and my sister who said, you should write a book, you might as well. You've already done all the writing for it. Poetry is also something that, many people can just, it's pretty digestible for people, and it's easier to publish, as far as like, if I'm just going to self-publish something, it's something. But I wasn't quite comfortable with just doing poetry. I wanted to mix in, and I know we'll probably talk about it a little bit later, about the why I chose to do poetry and the memoir style.
Mhm.
But it all kind of came down to, there was also a lack of resources available to young adults, and there still is a big gap when it comes to grief and being and experiences of grief when you're a young person. So I was hoping that maybe by publishing this book, it could fill that void a little bit. I will say it is, and I love this term, it's new to me, but it is a little bit of literary broccoli. So it's not a read that you're going to sit on the beach and read and it's like a feel good book. It is still memoir style. Poetry, though, could be read and taken and interpreted in any way that you like. But it's not going to fill this void that I think I was also hoping will eventually get filled, where we get more books that represent young adult grief in a variety of ways and that give people new perspectives on grief. I do think that that is what it's done a little bit. It gives some insight into my experiences with young adult grief, and a little bit of insight into what my relationship to communities are and what my sister's relationship to the communities might be, so that people can learn a little bit more about grief, and we can hopefully take steps in a direction that we destigmatize grief and that we create more spaces in our communities for it.
You're here, and I know that you wrote it from the perspective of your own experiences, so a youth experiencing grief. But I've got to tell you, as I was going through it, so much resonates to an older adult like me as well. And it just, there is a reach in your materials that you may not recognize or even have expected, that is across ages, genders, ethnicities. So I know your initial intention was to have a conversation starter for youth who are grieving, but boy, I can tell you it applies across the board to so many others. So thank you for the book. I wrote down literary broccoli because I'd never heard that term before. So thank you for something new. I don't know if others have ever heard of literary broccoli, but it's an interesting term. And I know we're going to come to at a later time too, but I'm not one who embraces poetry very, very easily. So I actually really am grateful that you had both the poetry and then I was saying stories, but you use the phrase memoir, so a correct terminology of poetry and memoir, and that combination, that made it for me, and I'll be saying periodically, each one became my next favorite poem, and it was my own interpretation. And sometimes I was on board or not on board, but in line with what your story was, and I got it. And other times I had taken a different path altogether. And that's what poetry allows us to do, is take a different path, our individual unique path towards the themes that you raise. So there are many, many themes that you've raised, but let's just talk about a few of them. Before, you talked about the lesson from your farming experiences that rest is important. And your first word on page 12, in terms of the poem, let's talk about resilience, is oof. It's like I can almost see oh gosh almighty, like, oh my gosh. And then you go on to talk about the love hate that you feel about that term resilience. You tell us that you'd been, and I'm using this quote, been conditioned by compliments of resilience to think that it was the only way I should behave. And you're so right. We always hear you should be very resilient, practice getting back and swinging back and feeling better afterwards. You're knocked down, get back up, be resilient, be resilient, be resilient, be resilient. I could almost hear you saying, oof, enough with that already. But it is something that you also strive for. So tell us a little bit more about this poem and about this theme for you and how it lands for you.
I think resilience for so many people is a word that people have such mixed feelings about. And I think that in the early parts of my grief, I always appreciated, and especially when I was really young, people would compliment me and my younger sister for, oh, you're so resilient, you know, you're so strong, it's awesome, you know, you're inspiring. And there came lots of points when I would receive those compliments and I would just shudder on the inside, and that would cause me to have a bit of a breakdown because I wasn't doing well, but I didn't feel comfortable talking to people about it because that was the conversations that I would have about grief with them, rather than them maybe opening up a door to ask a bit more about what how am I actually doing? And I think it is common for us, because grief makes people so uncomfortable, to quickly comment on how somebody's doing and try to be uplifting, try to make them feel better. But you're not going to take the pain away. You know, you're not going to take the grief away by doing that. It can be nice for people in some situations. And I speak from my personal experience here. Sometimes it was nice, but other times I found it really hard because it wasn't a good day for me. And I wasn't intending to smile, but I felt like that was the only thing that I could do to exist in my communities and to go out and go to class or whatever it is that I was doing. So I had originally actually thought to title the book "You Are Resilient" at an early stage of my grief, when I was thinking about writing the book years and years ago, because, you know, and to have this conversation about resilience, but I worried that people would take that a bit too literally and saying that I am telling people that you are resilient if you're a griever, but you don't have to be, and we aren't, you know, we can be, and it's a very human thing to, you know, face battles and beat them, but it's not always the case for everyone, and that doesn't look the same for everybody. So I think when we talk about resilience, we have to be incredibly careful. And I now today, even though I have lots of friends I find inspiring and I find very resilient, I be careful when I compliment them on that and make sure that I check in at the same time to say, I see you're doing wonderful. I see that you're being very resilient. Are you doing okay though? How are things, you know, behind the mask and behind the closed doors? But it's a very complicated relationship I have with the resilience. And I think a lot of people might feel the same way outside of grief, outside of mental health, and the relationships to identity, and everything.
We are so multifaceted, and you know, you talked about a mask. Is the mask of resilience something that we feel society is expecting of us, especially in this time when resilience is top of mind? That language is something we all hear about. And so is the mask of resilience what we're experiencing others, or is it true resilience? And in the moment when I see you, maybe it is true resilience, but 5 minutes before or 20 minutes later, you might be in a different state. That doesn't mean that you're not on that road, but it's not the only thing that's positive. It reminds me of conversations that we have about positivity, and people thinking positivity is you either think that it's the only way to go and living life with a rose-colored glasses, which is not my definition of positivity at all, but it's being able to see things even with darkness, but then be able to move forward with it. And I think your conversation about resilience is so really important, especially using that language of mask. Is it the mask of resilience, or is it true resilience at that moment, which could have been different before and different after? And yeah, and did that change for you from, in terms of you feeling, how did you get away from that, the condition of compliments of resilience? How did you move past that though?
I think that it's not something I've moved past quite yet. And I think that it's such a big part of society right now to still still compliment people on, you know, being resilient. And I appreciate what you're saying. There are moments of true resilience that is worth complimenting and like making mention of that and letting people know like that you find them inspiring and whatnot. um but I think that there is just for me, it's still a very complicated relationship that I have. And some days I might feel resilient looking back at a hard day that I, you know, managed to make it through and wake up the next. But that might not always be how I'm feeling in that very moment. Yeah, it's I like the mask. I'm not sure if I wrote that or if that was something that you had just said.
You said it, so I don't know where it came from, but
Yeah.
kudos to you. But it's true. The mask of resilience. And so, how did you? I'm just curious because you talked about that was, and I know that you do mention this in the book, but share with us how you decided, or when you decided, or why you decided to change the title from that, and you sort of explain the why, but to the title that you've actually given it. This grief thing fucking sucks. How did you come up with that?
I realized when I was writing it that that just captures the essence of this book a lot more. This grief thing does suck, and I think that a big part of my own healing journey has been accepting how hard my grief is, not feeling conditioned by compliments of resilience to feel like I have to always be putting out my best to be resilient. That's like the only option that exists for me. Right now, my comfort and what aligns most with how I feel about grief is that it just does suck. And that every day brings with it new challenges. And while I say it is something that I've learned to befriend, like grief is something that I have learned to befriend while writing this book, but every day I have to wake up and make the choice to be friends with my grief. And some days I'm not. And
Yeah,
some days that's okay because it sucks.
yeah.
It's not always the best thing to be around. So realizing that that is really what was capturing my current ideas about grief, but also realizing that young adults, so many of them are kind of feeling like they're trapped into having to be perfect despite their grief and all this. This is just a moment of saying, like, it sucks. I see you. I see that you're going through it. And it's okay to say that it's not going well. It's okay to be comfortable with the crappy parts of grief. And only by doing that are we actually, in my opinion, like going to heal. Because I, for the longest time, was putting the bad parts of my grief away and not really tapping into that.
I appreciate the comment, and also Rebecca's comment about the book resonating and the conversation resonating with people, not just for young people or for people later on who are experiencing grief later on, but those who may have experienced loss early on, but then did not have the tools. And suddenly, as an adult at a different stage, they're reading your book or hearing this conversation, being able to say, oh boy, you know what? Maybe there's something left that I have not had to deal with. Maybe I haven't processed. I love Rebecca's comment about processing my grief in a meaningful way. And this really does provide a tool, a resource for a conversation, and then some additional resources just to work through it. And one of the things, we'll come back to this, but one of the themes in your book that is consistent is there's no one way and there's no right way or wrong way to grieve. And I think I applaud you for saying that. Rebecca, when Taya and I were preparing, as I've been going through this book, different scenarios have come to my own mind, and I shared with her, and I'll share what an example as well. One of my very first losses was a dearly beloved uncle that was in Greece at that time, and my mom was grieving her own brother, and doing so in the way that she felt it necessary to do so. I was in my very late teens, early 20s when he passed, and I remember just putting on some music and dancing in my room. I was living at home, and my mom coming in, and in the traditional Greek grieving process, mourning process, not grieving, mourning process, you're not supposed to have music, TV, or anything on for 40 days traditionally. And here I was within about a few days playing music and dancing, it's a huge no-no. And she made a comment, and it was, it was unintended, not intended to hurt me, but she said, you're dancing on his grave. And I lost it at that point. I thought, oh my God, how could I do something so horrible? However, I didn't have the tools at that point. Neither did my mom at that point, to be honest with you. She had just lost somebody very significant in her life. So I think you're absolutely right, Rebecca, that this book really, as I was going through it, I thought, okay, I could get past that rift that had almost happened for a brief time with my mom, but also I could kind of say, you know what, Gina, you had to do it your way. You had to feel what you were feeling and move forward. So that permission, Taya, is so important, so very welcome, and I'm grateful to you for that. Past resilience. Let's go to the next one, and our mental health. I made a note to myself that I actually put a heart on page 35. I drew a little heart on the poem, and you've got a lot to say about mental health. And specifically, what I wanted to talk about is how we talk about mental health in the legal profession. I know you're just starting that state of your career, but you've been in law school and legal education for 3 years. Um, your book talks about women and men and mental health. You talk about grief, you talk about suicide, you talk about seeking support and creating safer spaces for others. What and how and why did you create these safer spaces for ourselves and for others? So talk about mental health in the legal profession and why it's so important for us to have these conversations.
I think that we can all recognize, as especially as research has been showing, like our productivity, our everything, and so much of who we are is impacted by where we're at mentally and our mental states. I'm not a mental health expert, so I'm not going to talk much about where, how we're going to make mental health, better, or how we're going to help each other. But I do know that starting the conversations about it, and for me, my advocacy is behind the fact that adding grief as a layer to conversations about mental health is incredibly important. In the same way that we have trauma informed lawyering as becoming a part of that conversation about mental health and how to also help clients that are experiencing trauma with our practices. I think it's incredibly important to also have a grief informed approach. I think that I do have a lot to say about mental health because my dad, and it's clear in my book, passed by suicide. And so to me, that's the whole conversation here about mental health. And it has encouraged me and my families and hopefully my communities to also look inwards at how we're doing mentally, and realizing that it's really important to have these conversations and to seek help when we're starting to go feel certain things that take us down a route of suicidal ideation. I think that it's still something that isn't talked about enough in mental health conversations, but it's because we're still working to become comfortable with the word suicide without everybody feeling like that is the breath taken out of the room. And even, yeah, whenever I talk about it, it's tough because I come from the grief perspective of suicide, but also my own relationship with mental health, and my knowing my certain family members' relationship with mental health. I think in the legal profession, getting comfortable with the language is a really good step. And I think that, for instance, your class, and some of the other lectures that we've had that bring in trauma informed lawyering tools and speakers, yourself as an advocate for mental health in the legal profession, I think there's so much that can be done, but there is really great steps being taken from the law student perspective where I am seeing, certain changes in at least my generation, really, really understanding mental health, and how it impacts us, and seeing the leaders in the previous generations helping to move that dial so that hopefully we can all join firms and we can all find jobs that we aren't having to choose a firm or our mental health, or having to choose, to go to work or our mental health. And I think that this happens beyond the realm of law as well. But I think it's a really, really unique conversation to have within law where we're helping, especially clients that might be facing a lot of these issues themselves.
You said so much in this short period of time, including in law and beyond, because what we're saying is not necessarily exclusive to law, obviously. And I think one of the areas that I felt really impressed by how it came out, how you were expressing it, is your own relationship to your dad's journey and to your dad's suicide, and being able to talk about that. And I'm sure that conversation and that writing evolved from when it first happened to you to you and your family as a very, very young child, to now being able to think about it at a later stage. But your advocacy for everybody, but especially for men, the people who are the tough guys or the athletes or the jocks who may not think that they should get help, or somehow it would seem wrong for them to get help. Your advocacy on behalf of your dad, your advocacy on behalf of all men who find themselves in that situation. Yes, women and men, but there's a different stigma that still exists in our community, in our space, and in our legal profession, for men in particular, I think you handled that beautifully. And that, I don't know which was harder. There were so many different parts that may have been hard, but your openness, your discussion, and your, I'm going to use the word again, advocacy in that respect, was incredible. Did you find yourself writing this at that time, or did that morph over time? I'm just curious.
I think it morphed over time. Much of this book morphed over time. So I've revisited these sections, and some of it was written when I was 14. And I revisited it when I was 21 and changed things I didn't agree with. But I do think that having the privilege of being a woman where in communities that are way more comfortable with these conversations and mental health in general, I really felt it was important to make note of my dad's story, hopefully to encourage other men to, seek help and recognize that they don't need to, be as impacted by the stigmas that exist, and that those stigmas exist, and that's why they might be feeling that way. And, it's okay to feel that way. But I definitely felt as a woman and having that privilege of, being really comfortable talking to my mom and my sisters and some of my friends about mental health, and knowing that so many men probably in my own life don't have that opportunity. Whatever I can do, from a female perspective, I tried. And I think that it was also just a nice little kind of ode to him to note that, this was the type of guy that he was before, maybe mental health kind of took a bit of a downfall, or it was who he was with his mental health throughout his whole life. We'll never know exactly, what he was dealing with, unfortunately, but also fortunately in an extent, because it is just a testament to who he was that, he might have been dealing with this his whole life. And he was, and in that You Are Resilient poem, I talk about his experience in one of the paragraphs. He's still incredibly resilient in my eyes, as all people that struggle with suicide or lose their own lives to suicide are, because it is an incredibly difficult experience. And just to choose one day to wake up is a form of resilience. And I wish and I hope that men and people that don't feel or that don't come from communities that can recognize that and the impact that mental health has on them, that they really know that the strength that they have, but also that it's a normal thing that you can feel, and that it's okay to reach for help. There's not lots of, but growing resources available.
So again, the Law Society has certain resources that people can reach out to. Schools have resources that people can reach out to. Communities have resources that you can reach out to. Organizations, if you're working in a firm, may have benefits that allow you to reach out for mental health support. So one of the things that I want to say, and I'll repeat it again later on, is that Taya has been very generous with providing a list of grief resources that we'll share afterwards. So I think it's really important. And to your point, various communities, whether it's men, whether it's certain cultures, or whether it's certain, whatever the case is. I can remember you took me back now about 10 or 11 years when the conversations around emotional intelligence, the conversations around mental health were starting to be had in open public spaces. And in the conversations that I'd had with a group of internationally trained lawyers, there was one woman who was very thoughtful and just kept staying off to the side. And she came up to me afterwards and said, in my culture, we don't speak about this. This is not something we discuss. And the fact that you are A, raising it, B, giving me permission to reach out and get some help. Thank you, because I have not had anybody to open up to and to have the conversations with. So we talked about resources. She moved on and did have some resources to receive. So thank you for the opportunity again for many of us to have the conversations, and I think it's important. There's so many, for those who may not be familiar, and I might include this in my materials afterwards and on the video portal, but there's a new book about with 6 or 7 different lawyers in different areas that talk about their mental health journey. And that's by I think proceeds go to CAMH, if I'm not mistaken, but I'll share that link with others. There was the national study from Sherbrooke about mental health in the legal profession. And again, the warning signs went up, but together with the reminder that let's just have the conversation. And we're all trying to do our best. And in a profession that can be quite stressful, recognizing that this is happening is so very important. So that part about the poem of our mental health is just such a very necessary addition for the conversation. So grateful to you for adding that. Um, as I was reading the book and got to, it's not about what you say on page 52, I wrote down my favorite poem. And I think I wrote that down later on a few times. But 52, it's not about what you say, was for me one of the first times that it really, really, really resonated with me. I love the reference to the power of a hug. I'm a hugger, and I know, the pandemic showed us all how much hugs were missed, I think, and not everybody's a hugger, and I get it. But in this and other areas of the book, you help others support grievers. And even that language, I'll be honest, of thinking about grievers or community of grievers was not language that I had really employed until I read your book. So what lessons and thoughts can you share on how to support others? And it's not about what you say. Tell us more about that.
I think that I think it's becoming really intuitive to a lot of people that experience trauma and that have experienced grief, that there is no perfect words or ways to, support somebody that's going through really hard times. But it's kind of, you're left with feelings based on people and how they interact with you, or it might be something that they say, but it's really, what, at least for me, it's the feeling that I'm left with and that I end up associating with who they are. And I was really fortunate that my mom kind of always grew up saying that to us, me and my sister, saying like, you should be kind people, because if you make people feel like, they're loved and they're seen and they're appreciated, you're going to be doing a lot of good for them, and for yourself, if you're looking to hopefully have that return to you. I think that poem specifically was actually one of my favorite poems as well. When I was writing it and reliving that experience of it, was my aunt that gave me a hug, and in a really, really dark and hard moment for me, it was permission. I like using that word, permission, for me to break down. And I think sometimes it's those little actions that give it to, or words and actions that give us that space and that moment to be like, it's okay to recognize that you're not resilient. You don't have to be resilient all the time, and that, grief sucks. So for me, that's what that poem was about. And it also was kind of an ode to that aunt that did a lot, has done and continues to do so much for me and my sister. Yeah, I was really, really happy when you pointed out that was a poem that you enjoyed, because it was one of my favorites to write and to experience through the writing process. I think you're on mute, sorry.
Yes, I am. Thank you. At that moment, you needed and wanted and craved that hug, or it was that permission from your aunt. But I'm wondering, are you generally a hugger, and do you offer hugs if you feel like it's appropriate, as your token of not token, but your gesture of care and support? Are you a hugger or not? I'm just curious if that's the case.
I'm like in the middle. I've never claimed to be like the most physical person, but like my friends will know me. Like I do give them a hug, and I'm very comfortable like when I know the person to give them a hug. But if it's somebody I'm like not super familiar with, then usually
Fair
I keep
enough.
it to myself.
We try and allow others their space that they need, so I totally get it. But your comment, I don't think I saw the quote, and somebody else can correct me, please. I think Maya Angelou has the quote. It's not how you make somebody feel, it's how you leave them. No, it's not what you say, but it's how you leave them. And I don't have the correct quote. If somebody can look it up and share it, but that, I don't think you quoted her, but that certainly is the sentiment, and that is certainly the intent of what you were talking about there. People may forget what you say to them. And I get this all the time from students years later. Oh, I remember in your office, I don't know what you told me, or in a conversation, but boy, you made me feel less stressful, or at ease, or more confident. And I don't know what words I used, if any words. It really sometimes is thank you, Ndija. I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but hang on a second, I've got to open that up. But people will never forget how you made them feel. Thank you. And I think that that quote always resonates with me whenever I read it, and I should memorize it, but I appreciate that. I love that quote. And I think that's a lot of what it's not about what you say kind of resonated in that instance as well. Taya, let's talk about motorcycles. Motorcycle love story. Okay. I put down in our notes, wow, because that was sort of, I had to pause after I said that. So another one of those, I love this poem moments as I was reading that one. Um, so here's where I want you to re-educate many of us, because I had always understood about the 7 stages of grief and how anger is just a natural part of that, and you're expecting it. And then when I saw the book and when I started reading it, when you and I had this conversation, the fact that there's a myth of anger as part of the grieving process, what happened? Where have we gone wrong all along this way? Because I really thought that 7 stages of grief were including anger. Tell us where we were wrong in that instance.
Yeah, so I had learned in my training at Bereaved Families of Ontario, this is something that we make sure we educate all of our volunteers on. And I'm happy to be a part of the movement to move away from this myth because it just does seem to be really stuck in our society. But that it's the 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Those actually came out of a study that was studying people who were going through the dying process. So people with terminal illnesses and whatnot. And it was to help them. It was a study that was done to help us understand how we understand death, but specifically for these people that are currently in the dying process. Somehow it got taken to apply to bereaved people, and that's where this whole mix-up has happened because also it doesn't really make sense, acceptance being the last stage of this process. Acceptance for grief isn't really something that is encouraged when it comes to thinking about grief in general. When you're thinking about therapeutically, you don't need to accept your grief, and it
You need to befriend it, is what you said, right?
friend
But
is
not
what I would
accept it.
say.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. But
Mhm.
it kind of becomes a part of you. So, anyways, what has happened is that this myth has kind of gone on to dictate that people that have experienced the loss of something and are experiencing grief need to go through these 5 stages or feel these 5 things. And it's just really, it's been disproven now through a variety of like studies, but also in many people's experiences that they either never feel these certain types of feelings, but they also don't necessarily feel them in this specific order. Grief is so subjective, and we're going to experience it and process it so differently. So yeah, when people would say that they're really angry, and they're just experiencing the stage of anger as a kind of a justification for their anger is justified. You don't need a theory to back up why you're feeling angry about a death. But it to me, that was always like, oh, I don't love that they're telling me I need to be angry, that this is a stage that I'm going to have to experience. Or have people asking, have you accepted the grief? It all comes out of this myth, unfortunately. But I know a lot of the grief kind of influencers and organizations and whatnot, they're really hoping to push that we get rid of this myth that's been disproven even for people that are in the dying process.
Thank you. Thank you for that clarification. And part of this story, if I'm not, or this poem and story, the part that I mean, I love the whole thing, but your mom had a passion for motorcycles, right? She loved motorcycles, and yes, it was a part of her death, but the poem in the fourth part, never a worry because life is short. Enjoy it or not. When you're a good sport, so happy we should be. Part of this, if I'm not mistaken, you can correct me or confirm, was the anger that others were feeling about your mom deciding to do something that she loved that happened to be a result of what caused her death. And so that was the anger that they were expressing at your mom potentially, and that is something hard for a young griever at that point to have to deal with. Is that accurate as well? The other people's anger at the person for living their life fully. And I love, Nadija, that you just brought your baby. That's okay. Thank you. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think that like underlying all of that, this conversation is it's so hard when a family loses somebody because everybody has their own grief and is going to process this death differently. And that definitely happened in the experience of losing my mom. Our community, really everybody processed it so differently. And one of the ways that people felt their grief was this anger towards my mom for how could she, get on a motorbike when she has two young girls, and, like this is a possibility. I know motorbike accidents happen quite often. I think this is something we're all very familiar with. But to me at that time, that wasn't really helpful for me in my grieving process, because the last thing that I was angry at my mom, besides being devastated, stressed, and all the other things. And it actually was not something I really ever felt was an anger towards her for doing that, because so much of I think the ability that I have and the tools that I have to process grief and to, at least feel really comfortable where I am today with my mental health arises because my mom was that type of person that showed us, despite all this loss and despite, all the hard parts of life, we should still do the things that make us happy. And for my mom, that was riding a motorbike. And I do love the motorbike love story, because my mom and dad met on a motorbike, and that's what I talked about. And it was just something that it made her so happy. So I couldn't be angry at her for doing something that she loves so much. I'm just so glad, especially seeing her through widowhood, having been devastated, having a really hard time finding happiness. I would never have wished anything else but for her to find these things that make her happy and to do them.
Yeah, no, I agree with Nadita. That is pretty powerful. And I wonder if I'll ask this question. Do you do things that bring you joy? And did it take you a while to get there after your mom passed? Or was that lesson of let me do the things that I need to do? Let me live life because I don't know how long I have. Is that something that was ingrained in you as soon, that you espouse now and then? You did it then as well? Or did that take a while for you to, like me and my dancing, and I'll give that example. I never would have thought, oh my God, dancing, but yeah, that was something that was important. So I'm just wondering if you continue to do the things that that made you happy, that gave you joy.
I think that both me and my sister always recognized from a young age, like because of how our parents lived and this being a kind of core tenets of who they were, that finding the things that make us happy were really important. I think I'm always on a new journey of like what's going to make me happy now, and also balancing my own relationship with mental health, anxiety, and stress. How do I find the things that make me happy when I'm in law school and I'm busy like all the time as lawyers? Like it's hard to make time for these things. But it definitely gives me something to think about all the time. And I do try my best to take that time for me. Writing has been, through the book, poetry has always been something I've turned to. And I hope I'll continue to turn to those kind of artistic mediums, because that is definitely one of the things that bring me a lot of joy, but also allow me to process some of the things that I haven't allowed myself the space to previously.
Yeah, and to you and anybody watching who is in practice or going into articling or any stage of the legal profession, or any other profession, making time, not trying to find, but making the time, making it a priority to do the things that give you joy. I remember many times during exam periods or just before exam periods, when I would talk to students who say, I've not gone out to a mall with my friends, if that's something that they enjoy, or to a movie, or I've not seen my friends for the past 2 months. And I would pause and I'd say, make sure you do that tonight or on the weekend. No, I can't. Yes, you can. You won't be able to do the next stage of what you need, your exam or your prep or whatever, your motion or whatever it is that you're doing in the profession of law, unless you make that time and that you prioritize that time. And I think our leaders in many of the different organizations need to really get a grasp and grip on that and understand that we cannot just do the work without having that time to do the things that really fill us up, and give us that additional joy. So I'm glad that you keep doing that, and I think that's really important. My other one favorite poem to another, Bikini on a Gravestone. And I'm so grateful to you for including two beautiful pictures at the end. I mean, they're all of them of your family were beautiful, but they're the two gravestone pictures in particular. And that poem about doing what you want and needing to how you want to grieve. This chapter was really powerful. How does a griever find the strength and clarity? How did you find the strength and clarity to grieve the way that you wanted to? Showing a bikini on a gravestone, why not, right? But there's so much religion, culture, gender dynamics, so much on us to grieve right or grieve properly. Let me throw it over to you. What do you think about all of that?
There's so much that can be impacted in this conversation alone. The one thing I'll note is it also goes back to what we were previously saying about how everybody grieves so differently. And I think it's really important always to give yourself the space and the time and the permission to grieve however you need to grieve. And picking plaques and picking, these memorabilia for your people you've lost or pets or whatever it is a big part of that. But it also evolves. And there, it's also fine if you, loved it at one point, you didn't in another. But all this to say is it's expected, and it was expected that not everybody was going to agree with this choice that me and my sister had made to include this photo of my mom. And it's something that I still feel, empathy, and might feel, I still feel sometimes bad about, not always some of our family members not loving, this plaque because of religious or other views. But it wasn't, I wouldn't say it was so much strength that took the choice to put this picture on there. We had a really hard time picking an image to go on my mom's plaque. And as you can see in the picture, we had a really, really beautiful photo for my dad that my mom had picked out. And it kind of took us months, and usually you're supposed to pick right away, what the plaque is, and we kept on getting pushed to make a decision. And so this was the only photo that kept on appearing as an option, and I just really loved the way that the water flew, like went between the two plaques to kind of show their connectedness. But also it was important to me that they not be put together because of the 5 years my mom spent growing on her own, and healing from really what had happened, and the form of widowhood that she had to take, and the way that she had to grow as a person without my dad. But all of this to say, this was just how I was feeling and how I feel about, their deaths, my grief, and not everybody agrees. And so it's important to be strong and to be able to, say this is what I need and this is what I need for my grief. But I also recognize it's important to see that everyone else around you is also grieving and might feel, very differently about that. And I would, this is kind of a separate conversation, but I would implore people to maybe explore options like death doulas or other, bringing in other perspectives to help manage, when your grief might contradict somebody else's grief, and a lot of the issues that might come up with, estate administration from a lawyerly perspective, a lot of the conflicts that might arise there, whether it be mediators or, a death doula that can help with picking and navigating big feelings in relation to memorabilia. But I think that ultimately, giving yourself the permission to do what feels right to you is important, and right to honor the person or the pet or whatever it is, the loss that you've experienced, is important if you think it's going to be helpful in your grief and healing journey, with the note that everyone else might also be grieving and need different things as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. I hadn't sort of made that connection because there are people grieve differently, and that's over a long period of time. We did a religious blessing at my parents' gravestone this past weekend. Dad has just been 2 years. Mom is approaching 3 years. And a very good family friend of ours who's a priest had agreed to come and just do a blessing. And it was casual. We were at the cemetery, but we brought our dog. And I didn't even think twice about it. When somebody said, there's a priest, are you okay bringing the dog? I said, the dog was the actual the thing, the person, or the soul that was able to make my dad laugh for the last time. And I thought, yeah, I kind of want I want our dog around there. But was thinking that, okay, I didn't realize that this might make other people uncomfortable. So or leaving little memorabilia at the site. So you're right. I had never. I guess I'm espousing. I'm doing what I need to do, what I want to do with my sister and my family, but some people don't agree with that, and whether it's religious or cultural or whatever else, it really can be a minefield to navigate sometimes, in terms of what choices we have. But the bikini on a gravestone really just reiterated being able to, maybe it's not strength, but it's clarity. And I think it was in this chapter where you encourage people to share what they want, to share what they want after they die as well. And I thought, wow, okay, so for a young adult to be able to think that clearly ahead of time and encourage people to have that conversation. Most people say, no, 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 I can't talk about, what I want after death. But it's such a pressure potentially on those that are left behind, that why not have that conversation? And these are not conversations that we typically have, right? So for you to encourage, thank you. Was that because of the challenge that you may have had in picking that photo, or was it because of other conversations you've had with family or friends since then about themselves, for example?
So many, yeah, a lot of it comes from my experiences with like my mom's death, but also my dad's death. I saw my mom struggle to decide what my dad wanted because he never talked to her about it either. So having these two experiences has really shown me the importance of like leaving these notes or like a list of wishes to your family. And I know there's a lot of resources coming out. Like I have a couple friends that are death doulas, and this is what they do. They go in, they help people manage their final affairs legally, but also not so much legally. I mean, get a lawyer legally, but to help them decide what options are out there for burial or memorabilia, because there are so many options now that are becoming available. And I would encourage anyone that's really interested in, what options there are for them, that are happy to explore these conversations, to go to the Good Morning Festival. It's going to be one of the resources that's available in Gina's list afterwards. But there's a really cool like green options for burials that they'll be at the Good Morning Festival. But there'll also be lots of conversations there about the different options. I think there's also a card game that it's like a game that about after death or like options for death, death cards or something, that you could play with your family to learn about these options and tell them, this is something I'd actually really like, or, please don't do this with me. I'm not comfortable with that. Because especially as more options are available, we should be having these conversations.
It's interesting. I just realized when you said good morning, it's probably spelled MOURNING. Okay, it took me a second to register that. And what do you do if somebody does not feel comfortable having a conversation? Because, as we talked about in terms of the motorcycle, no, not motorcycle love story, doing what you want to do. No, the story about doing what you want to do and doing what you love to do because life is short. Sometimes we don't have a chance to have these conversations. So and if you do raise it, okay, it's Friday night, Saturday night, or Sunday dinner, family dinner, let's have this conversation. People may resist. What do you do when people resist the conversation? Because you got to respect it, or don't you?
I haven't had this experience quite yet. So thankfully, like I think most people when I approach them, I say, hey, we should like talk about this. Like they know my background, so probably why I want to have this conversation with them. But I would encourage you to kind of maybe find out why. Like, why are they feeling this way about death and grief? It's not, I personally don't like when someone comes at me and says, well, you should for this reason, that reason, that's grief and death is such a personal experience. It's not anybody's place to tell you what you should or shouldn't be doing. But it is interesting to know why they might be feeling that way. And even just kind of giving some maybe background about, this is why I am making my wishes and these are my thoughts on it. And here's some options for you. I love sending people resources. Like whenever there's hesitation in the air about something, I'll just send a ton of different options, especially if someone, for instance, is experiencing grief and, doesn't want to go to grief therapy. There's lots of other options, peer support, like grief craft nights, like so many things that go on, especially in Toronto. So sending them the resources, but also asking maybe why is what I would say.
Wise beyond your years. But in any event, I've got a couple more questions that I want to ask you, but I do want to open it up. If anybody has any comments or questions, I want to pause for a second just to see if any, and I know this is a difficult topic potentially, but let me just pause before I move on to the last couple of questions. Anybody have any comments or questions for Taya on the topic? Rebecca, join us, please.
Hi, Taya. Hi, Gina. And I just wanted to, this isn't so much on what you were just talking about, but I was I have a question about your relationship with writing now, because it's been such a part of your process. And your book is just so beautifully written, but also constructed. Like, just you made this, like, you created this thing over years and in all these different ways, and you express so much. And so I'm curious about your, I guess, your current writing relationship.
Great question.
Yeah.
That's a funny question because lately I've been asked by a bunch of different like organizations and community groups I'm a part of to like write poems for their zines and whatnot. And it's usually something I would never hesitate because I love writing usually, but it can be really hard. And I know that in writing this book, especially the latter stages of the editing process, now reading it and seeing errors and things that I'm like, oh my gosh, like I can't believe this wasn't caught by me or 6 of the different editing rounds I had with professional editors. Like it drives me a bit nuts. So my relationship with writing right now is a bit complicated because I am not aspiring to be an author or, continue down this writing journey, but it is still a very therapeutic tool for me. And as long as I, frame it as being something I'm only doing when, I need it, and it's something that provides me some sense of healing, then I know it's not a chore the way it was when I was maybe doing some of the editing rounds on this, then I'm in a healthier space with it. But it is interesting because I have maybe opportunities coming up to continue writing and doing a bit of an author route. And I'm reassessing every day. Is that actually something I'd want to do? Or do I want to continue publishing work? Or is this something I'm ready to close the doors and just keep to myself again? I don't know. It's evolving.
Mm-hmm. Great question, Rebecca.
Thank you.
Anybody else? We talked a little bit about poems, and on Rebecca's question, 2 things have come up in my mind. One is you were doing a whole bunch of reading and writing for law school, and I don't know how you ended up finishing off and then publishing in 2L in second year, because there's a lot of other writing that you have to do, the shoulds in law school. So kudos to you, and I think that's where the therapeutic part of it came off. But you were going to tell us about your choice in using a combination of poetry and memoirs, and how some people were suggesting don't do that. Tell us a little bit about why you selected ultimately to do that poetry and memoir combo.
I think it goes back to kind of the whole conversation we've been having, that grief is just so personal and you got to do what works for you. This was what worked for me. If I was going to share any of my writing, I wanted to make sure I did it in a way that I was going to be comfortable. And I was really hesitant to either just share pieces in a more memoir only book or just poetry, because again, I'm not an author. Like I didn't go to school for this.
You are an author.
I mean, I'm an author.
You are an author.
Yes.
If I had maybe gone to school for this, I would have had a more clear set view on what, what I wanted to publish if I also was planning on going down the traditional route. But this to me was just my way to get my writing in the world, but also in a way that I was going to be comfortable with sharing my story. Me and my sister had opted, and I think my family, for my dad, we'd always opted to not have like news articles published about what our family had experienced. It was an option. I remember when my mom passed away, it was an option to share this, on the newspapers, and we opted not to keep kind of this. And I think it worked for us at that time. And I'm glad that was a good choice I think we made, because it has allowed me to take that space to grieve the way I needed to, and then share our story the way that I feel comfortable. And I say early on in the book, like, I'm not the most trustworthy narrator. Like when we experience grief and trauma, we like forget so much. So maybe some of the things I share in this book weren't even accurate, like things that happened. It might have just been my experience of these things, especially like right after the death of my mom. I don't remember like months, it feels like. And so if I was going to be sharing anything about it, I just wanted to make sure it was from the voice and from, the experiences that I know were true to me. And yeah, also self-publishing to keep that kind of control was my choice there. If I were to maybe go down the traditional publishing route, then I'd want to, learn more about what that means and how I would do that and remain, my authenticity there.
I'm so glad that you remained authentic. Nadija, over to you.
What role did your sister play in kind of like vetting the narrative and sort of going through the edits and whatnot?
That's a great question. It was actually one of the hardest parts about writing this book was I was so scared to share the story on her behalf without her permission, or share things that she wouldn't want shared with the world because we had kind of remained this level of privacy about our grief and our experiences. She was one of the ones that had suggested to me that I could write a book. But then throughout the editing process, I sent it to her and I asked her, are you comfortable with me talking about this? And for both of us, the conversations about suicide and mental health were very, very like hard for us to decide, like, what do we share? You know, what do we share about mom and dad, and like what permanence do we give to who they were like in this book, and what stories are we comfortable with. I did run most of it by her and she had final authority signing off before I clicked submit to Freeze and Press. I said, Sam, are you sure that we're doing this? And she was comfortable with it. She's been my biggest support throughout the process, and just throughout my grief, so I was so glad when she was encouraging of it all.
Great question. And you know, I love the relationship that the two of you obviously have, and may that continue forever and for a long, long time. Your poem called Sympathy Cards, page 113. First of all, the fact that it's a compilation, if I'm not mistaken, of different verses or comments that people, and I don't know if they were actually from different cards or just things that you would remember, is really quite beautiful. And I have to tell you, I was sitting there in the AI conference this afternoon, thinking about this particular chapter because I don't know how many people in my life I have heard say, I don't know what to write on this card. I have no clue what I should write in the card. I'm not going to write anything. I'm not going to send anything. And this is going to sound maybe absolutely crazy, but I thought, would Chat GPT have a whatever where you say, I need to write a sympathy card for, you know, a friend, a family member, whatever, give me some language. I know you could Google it probably right now, but that's where my mind went. Again, the technology and the link to what you're talking about. But this particular poem offers thoughts on how to support grieving friends and colleagues. And you had some suggestions, I think, that was a really good reminder. Apart from people will grieve their own way, you as a support for grievers, what are some of your thoughts on that?
I think this is also a question that I get a lot from friends that are like, oh, you know, you have this experience, you know, how should I write this card? And I also feel a lot of pressure now to write cards that, you know, are good and to say things that are right. And I have to give myself permission, you know, there is no right things to say. There is definitely like, everybody has their own things that are going to make them feel good. And it might be completely different from me. I personally like, found that it wasn't very helpful when people were like, I'm sorry for your loss, or anything that was more religious, because of my relationship to religion. But I really, really loved when people wrote on their sympathy cards stories about their relationship with my parents. And from what I've heard in a lot of my young adult peer support groups, and peer friends, that is something that a lot of young adults appreciate hearing about their parents, because it's often a side that they didn't quite know, or they didn't quite get the opportunity to get to know that version of their parent. And one of the most like touching things I remember after my dad's death, was a family friend of ours that was his friend he grew up and went to high school with. He kind of just passed me this group of papers one day and I was like, what is this? And it was like he'd spent hours typing stories from high school with my dad. And it was honestly, and to this day is one of those gifts that I like, am just absolutely floored by. And the one thing I would say though is with these words and with these gifts, and if you're looking for advice about grief, to make sure you're doing it completely taking yourself out of the question, because for instance, I read the first like paragraph of like this huge stack of papers and I had to put it away for months. And so I said thank you to him, but I was never able to really engage with him on, you know, this incredible gift that I was given, because I wasn't comfortable or ready to read these stories yet. It took, I think, years for me to get through all of them and really digest, you know, who my dad was in high school based on these stories. So I recommend whenever my friends ask me like, oh, oh, what should I write? Like stories are often a good, you know, kind of baseline if you want to share a little bit of input about who that person was to you and why you loved them and why, you know, you were going to miss them, is always like a good starting spot. Some people might not like it, so I'll leave that disclaimer in there. That's personally something I've really enjoyed and my sister's really enjoyed. But also recognizing that whenever you do give a gift or you know, write a note, that you're not expecting a response, and that you'll give that person as much time as they need to digest that and maybe never get a response. I know, Gina, you'd also mentioned that like some of the best gifts was someone dropping off food. And I would say me and my sister as well, someone would just like, if they just dropped off food but expected nothing, they didn't want to come in, they just like, they knocked on the door and ran to their car because they knew that we probably weren't in the space to talk to anyone or see anyone. Those are really good acts, sometimes for people, especially in the fresh stages of grief, that can help. The one other thing I would recommend if it's a young adult griever, kind of specifically from that, if you have like professional like services that you can offer. This was something that we found really helpful when we had family and friends that connected us with like professional services, that whether it be financial advisors or accountants or lawyers, you know, if you know, get a state's administration lawyer, that would always be a good recommendation, because obviously a lot of young adults, we don't know that. So those were also really nice kind of ways to help grievers that I would recommend.
And I think you also, you know, both reference in the book and during some of our conversations, asking, don't be afraid to ask. You know, I've often heard people say, don't ask somebody what they need or what they want, because just do it. Just take it upon yourself to cook something for them or drop something off. But sometimes that might be overwhelming for an individual as well. And how do you navigate that? Should we ask? Shouldn't we ask? What's your way of doing it?
I personally also had a really complicated relationship when people would like say, oh yeah, I'm here if you need anything, you know, let me know if you need anything. I never let them know. You know, I was always like, I'm not very comfortable like asking. But the people that I was comfortable letting know was when they gave me kind of a more specific set of instructions. They're like, I'm at the grocery store right now. You know, I'm going to be driving by your house on the way home. Is there anything that you need? You know, like, can I get you something? I know people, I think there was like one of the people that I've worked with in peer support said like toilet paper, like everyone always needs toilet paper. Like you can drop off something like that, something you know that like people need. But when you're asking or you're offering support, you can kind of give a bit more of a defined instruction of what you mean by that. Can help give people the permission to feel like they can ask for something, rather than leaving it all up in the air for them to decide.
And if, depending on the stage, they might just need space and time. They might just want you to walk away and turn around and stay away, or they might want you just to sit down and let them cry, let them talk, let them whatever. And I can't, many people who've gone through the process, I'm thinking of two individuals who lost their dad really, really young. They were only 5 and I guess he would have been 9 at the time. And over the years, you know, I would check in with their mom, but we would talk about their dad. And initially, like, should we or shouldn't we? But they wanted it. And whenever we saw that it might not be something they'd want to do, we'd step back. But there's so many people that are afraid to talk about the person who's passed. And sometimes you crave it. They were such a huge part of your life up until that time. But again, there's no right or wrong answer. And on that part, I want to, serendipity blew me away. As people who joined in the past know, serendipity is a favorite word of mine. So when I saw that poem on page 149, serendipity, I stopped in my tracks. I think I texted you right then and there about how I was just kind of, whoa, the fact that you're writing about this word and about your mom and the combination of serendipity. Such a beautiful poem and such a beautiful story that attached to that poem. So I'm going to ask you, what else do you want to tell us about your mom? This is your chance to tell us either about serendipity or about your mom.
Thank you, Gina. It's so sweet. I read that you left this question there. I was like, that is actually so sweet. And I think we covered a lot of like the things that I would love to share. Was like my mom was so, I found it was so important, especially after we lost our dad, to really find what makes you happy, and to pursue that as a form of like a tool for your grief. And I think that I owe a lot of my ability and my health, my happiness today to her and to the tools that she gave me and my sister through the loss of our dad to be able to handle her loss and manage her loss. And so that would be my main, I think, comments is, yeah, finding what makes you happy, making sure that you live authentically. And to being, my mom was a very authentically like herself person. And I really appreciate that because it gave us a good template for how to grieve, but also how to live in a happy way. The one other thing I wanted to kind of note that I remembered while we were just chatting was especially as lawyers, ways that we can help like people that are grieving is through like advocacy for that person in the workspace. That was kind of one of the notes that I haven't had the opportunity yet to do that as a lawyer, but I know in other, environments that I've been in work environments, it's really important to recognize the power that you have as a friend to somebody that's grieving, as a work friend, to be able to make sure that the workspace is accommodating to their bereavement and to their grief, because yeah, that's going back to work. And I know there's a lot of advocacy going around about bereavement policies and, how many days people should be able to take off for bereavement after death, but also annually to celebrate that, death, or celebrate their birthdays of the people that you lost. So being a good work friend would be, as a lawyer, especially advocating for that person if you know that they're experiencing grief in ways that they need more time or they need help in these different ways, would be really helpful in general. And one of the other little grief things that things that have helped is one of the people that was the most like helpful for us after both of our losses are people that would just come in and clean. I don't know if obviously this isn't for everybody, but if you're looking for something and you have a close friend and you want to help, but they keep saying no, one of the offers that we would get was like, I just want to come and clean your bathrooms. Like, I know it's not something you want to do, but let me just come in, stock and clean your bathroom. You won't see me. And I had a couple people knock on the door just to come in and clean. And that was honestly some of the best gifts that we got during those times. And I think even as work friends, there's little things like that we can do for each other. Clean their desk. I don't know. Maybe as a lawyer, that's an option. But yeah, I think in general, I'm super glad that we got to have this conversation, Gina, and thank you so much for really engaging with my book in ways that I haven't really gotten to hear other people's like opinions on and engagement with. So thank you so much for this space.
You're very welcome. And I really want to thank, and Rebecca, you sort of expand on this as well in terms of your comment. And I hadn't thought about it until you just said it. Workplace advocacy, not just as a friend or a colleague, but I'm going to go the next stage too. Think about it in terms of anybody who's in a leadership role. It's so very important. All of these issues that you just talked about, all these themes about how many people either will lie or not share why they'll take a sick day, which is fine, but to celebrate the anniversary of or a birthday of. And I'm now self-employed, but even when as I was experiencing it, my parents, I did celebrate their birthdays with mom and dad. I would take their birthdays off. And if I was not self-employed, being able to do that without feeling nervous or upset or shame or whatever the case might be, and having a colleague and a boss and a friend who appreciates that and advocates for you, I think is really, really useful. So again, that's why this is not only a book for youth grievers, but so broadly relevant. And Rebecca, your point, other non-legal skills through our work experience that can be helpful: process management with paperwork, organizing people and documents, helping with written communications. You're right. There's so many other skills that we bring that we could certainly support others in the workplace and not in the workplace necessarily. Taya, you've thanked us, and I want to just, as we close up, just a couple of things. So as a reminder for anybody today or watching later, 1.5 hours of EDI credit, given the themes and the topics that Taya has so beautifully covered with us here today. Taya, a huge thank you for taking us through some of the highlights of the book. There's so much more that we did not cover, but on page 144, and I was trying to find the closing because I always try and find something that is sort of personalized, but on page 144, you thank your mom, your dads, your sister Sam, the readers, and you end with a quote that I hope you take to heart as well, for yourself. Be proud of your victories. Be proud of your strength, and give yourself the space you need to grieve. All our love to you, Taya, as well. So thank you so very much. And if you want to connect with Taya or I, there is, I'm going to share it on the screen. Hopefully it's showing there. Your email, Taya, I hope we've got it correctly. We did look at this, but hopefully we had it correctly. Your website, which is a beautiful website. And I know I didn't ask you, the cover page. Who is this?
Yeah, I made it.
So you did what?
I made it.
You created this.
Yeah, and it's my sister on it and her friend, but I covered it up for the look.
That is, you create, so very artistic, very beautiful, and there will be grief resources that we will be sharing. Thanks to Taya for the resources that were available. If you enjoyed the conversation, please tell your friends about it. Share her book widely and the resources that we have. And I hope that you join us next time for our conversation. It'll be a little bit different with Sharon Drodge about idea, personal roadmap to authenticity. I say a little bit different, but again, you have found a way to grieve so authentically and have helped us to do that as well. I'm just looking at the messages, and thank you to everybody. Very powerful and so necessary is a comment that I totally agree with. Taya, and to everybody who's joined us, thank you. I am forever grateful for this book. Have a really good night, everyone. Take care. Bye now.
Bye.
Thank you.